It's wonderful to be together in worship as we continue a series, and the series is called Questions You Should Answer. I'm going to say a sentence, and I want you to tell me what the next word is in this sentence, because you will all know what the next word is. Now, I'm not one to judge. Always, right? Always. It's as though someone were to go to the piano and on the piano play dun 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 dun. I mean, always. And you have to finish it. Well, it's that way with this sentence. Now, I'm not one to judge, but that always comes next. And then after that comes the judgment. Jesus said, "Don't judge, so that you will not be judged." Now that's a hard saying of Jesus, because we have to judge, don't we? As a father and a grandfather, one of the things I have prayed for and pray for my family is that our daughters and now grandchildren will be able to judge. That is, that they will be able to judge right from wrong and be able to judge something of the motives of another person, or whether or not another person is trustworthy. That's important. Judge good from evil. We have to be able to judge. As a citizen of the United States or a citizen of this county or city, when it comes to election time, whatever the election is, we need to be able to make some judgments, don't we, in order to fulfill our responsibility and our right as citizens to vote. We have to be able to judge. Otherwise, what is evil would be rampant and would have no one to stand up for those who are caught in its grasp. So human trafficking, or the selling of drugs on our streets, or violence in some of our neighborhoods, or racism, or whatever it is, we need to be able to judge. I have friends whose job it is to judge. They are judges. They sit on the bench, and we have to have them. But Jesus says, do not judge. Perhaps a better way to think of the kind of judging we must do is to think of it as discernment. To discern what's going on, to discern right from wrong, to discern whether or not a person is trustworthy. It's that sort of judging that Jesus did not prohibit. In fact, he said to his disciples as he sent them out, he said, "I am sending you out as sheep among wolves. Be wise as serpents and innocent as doves." I am sending you out, and there are wolves in sheep clothing, he says. Beware of them. Do you hear in those words, Jesus is saying something about discernment, about paying attention to what's going on, about a certain kind of care that we all have to take. So what does Jesus mean when he says, don't judge? Well, he goes on to say, don't judge, or you'll be judged. And then he says, why do you see the splinter in your brother or sister's eye, but don't notice the log in your own eye? Or he says, how can you say to your brother or sister, let me help you with the splinter, let me take the splinter out of your eye, when you have a log in your own eye? You deceive yourselves, Jesus says. And then he says, first, take the log out of your own eye, and then you can see clearly to take the splinter out of your brother or sister's eye. Jesus is talking about a way of seeing ourselves and others. It is a kind of seeing that we have to pay attention to. The questions that he asks are, Why do you see the splinter in your brother or sister's eye? How can you take it out if you've got this log in your own eye? The question for us, as I've framed it this morning, is what is that in your eye? That's the question for us. Because it's important for us to pay attention to the health of our vision. Jesus is speaking here about a real spiritual danger. And there are warning signs that go with recognizing when there's something wrong with our vision, when there's a log in our eye. My father was very nearsighted, and he also had problems with his retina. Those two go together, I've learned from my ophthalmologist. I was very nearsighted before I had LASIK surgery 8 years ago, and my ophthalmologist told me that I have to be very careful because with nearsightedness, because of the shape and the size of the eye, that there is a little bit greater risk for retina problems. So every time he looks at the retina, but he always says the same thing to me. He says, if anything about your vision changes, come see me immediately. If there's a dark spot that suddenly appears, if there are flashes of light, if there is a blank spot in your field of vision, spots that don't move around, come and see me immediately, he says, every time. What he's doing is he's reminding me of the warning signs that there's something wrong. And Jesus is saying that we need to pay attention to whether or not there is a log in our own eye. And there are warning signs that go with that as well. One of those warning signs is a kind of fuzziness in the center of our vision that keeps us from seeing what's central, that keeps us from seeing where Jesus is leading us to follow. There may be a log in our eye if we experience that. A warning sign is when we look in a mirror and our own reflection is very fuzzy and not clear at all, but we have this crystal clear peripheral vision that can see others very clearly. That's a warning sign as well. Someone has said we have the ability to look at others' faults with a microscope, but with our own we look at our own faults through the wrong end of a telescope. That's a warning signal that there's something up with our vision, that there is a log in our eye if our ability to see ourselves is foggy, but the ability to see others is crystal clear. That is, the ability to see others' faults and not our own. That's the kind of judging that Jesus is talking about. One of my favorite stories that comes from American history, from the history of the Senate, in the 19th century, when Mormons still practiced polygamy, there was a Mormon named Reed Smoot from Utah who was elected a senator from Utah. The other senators did not want him to be seated. He was, after all, part of a group that practiced polygamy. Now, he himself did not practice polygamy, nor did he approve of it, but he was part of that group, and so they did not want him to be seated in the Senate. And there was quite a controversy over Reed Smoot's election and whether or not they would allow him to be seated in the Senate of the United States. This controversy came to an abrupt end when a senator from Pennsylvania, Boyce Penrose, went to the podium and he looked at his fellow senators, some of whom were philanderers, and he said to them, "You know, I would rather have seated next to me a polygamist who doesn't polyg than a monogamist who doesn't monog." And in that moment, there was a certain clarity of vision where those senators who had been blind to that image in the mirror while seeing very clearly what they perceived to be the fault in another, the image became much clearer for them. They had a log in their eye, and they needed it to be removed. Or think about the mother and the teenage daughter standing in the kitchen. The teenage daughter says to her mother, "Hey, I see some white hairs on your head." And the mother says, "Well, for every time you made me cry, for every bad thing you did, I got one of these white hairs." And so the teenage daughter said, "So why is Grandma's hair all white?" So in a moment, the mother's vision is sharpened a little bit to see herself. Or maybe you know the story, I suspect you do, of the woman who's waiting in the airport to catch a plane. She goes and buys a package of cookies. She sits down and she's engrossed in her book, and pretty soon she's aware that this guy sitting on the seat, one seat over from her, is opening the package of cookies right there next to her, and he eats one of the cookies. And so she's floored by this behavior, and she looks at him, gives him a nasty look, and doesn't say anything, but she reaches over and grabs a cookie and eats it. And he takes another cookie and eats it, and she takes another cookie and eats it, and then there's one left, and then he breaks it in half and leaves half in the package. He gets up and he leaves. She's furious. How dare him? And to break the last cookie in half as though he's sharing my cookies with me. And she's just fuming, and she gets on the plane and she's furious, and she sits down and she reaches in her purse for a tissue and finds her package of cookies. And in that moment, the whole scene is reframed for her. And she sees in a new way. We need those moments. We need to ask ourselves the question, what's in my eye? How am I seeing myself, and how am I seeing others? One of the warning signs is a lack of depth perception. If we lose our depth perception, we lose the ability to see beyond the surface in the other person, to see with any depth their own experiences and their own struggles and their own issues that they share in common with us, because we all, as human beings, share some common struggles. And sometimes we can forget that, and there's a log in our eye and we can't see that. We lose our depth perception, and we only see the surface of what's going on. And that's when we judge, in the sense that Jesus is warning us about. I remember the time when I learned this most clearly, and perhaps it was the first time for me, and that's why I remember it. I was a teenager. I was serving as a counselor in a camp in Louisiana called Caney Conference Center. It was an elementary camp, and I was one of the youth counselors in that camp. And there was there a pastor who was rude, I thought. He was short-spoken. He seemed to have no patience with anyone. And so I complained to my youth director. I said, "That guy's a jerk. He shouldn't even be here." And my youth director said, "Sit down." So I sat. And he said, "Do you know anything about him?" And I said, "No, I just know he's a jerk." "Do you know," he said, "that his wife died 2 weeks ago from cancer, and it's been a horrible time for him?" No. My depth perception was such that I could not see beyond the surface of his behavior to know what's going on with this man, to know how he was suffering, to know that it was just hard enough for him to be present there, much less to be in ministry, giving of himself to other people. He was angry. He was grieving. He was all of those things that I hadn't even considered, because I really didn't see him. Jesus said, "Take the log out of your own eye so you can see clearly." And sometimes we lose this depth perception, so we don't see beyond the surface. I ran across this week some letters that were written to Ann Landers a long time ago, back in probably the late 80s. And a checkout clerk wrote to her a letter of complaint. She had seen shoppers with food stamps buying luxury items like birthday cakes, bags of shrimp. And the angry woman went on to say that people on welfare who treat themselves to non-necessities were lazy and wasteful. A few weeks later, Lander's column was devoted entirely to people who responded to that grocery clerk with letters of their own. One woman wrote this: "I didn't buy a cake, but I did buy a big bag of shrimp with food stamps. So what? My husband had been working at a plant for 15 years when it shut down. The shrimp casserole was for our wedding anniversary dinner and lasted 3 days. Perhaps the grocery clerk who criticized that woman would have a different view after walking a mile in my shoes." Or another woman wrote, "I'm the woman who bought the $17 cake and paid with food stamps. I thought the checkout woman would burn a hole through me with her eyes. The cake was for my little girl's birthday. It will be her last. She has bone cancer and will probably be gone within 6 to 8 months." See, the problem is the clerk had a log in her eye. Her depth perception was so impaired, she could not look beyond what seemed obvious to her. To be able to walk a mile in those shoes, or to be able to really see her brother or sister. What is that in your eye? That's the question for us to ask. And Jesus said to his disciples, and I believe is saying to us, you deceive yourselves with that log in your eye. First, take the log out of your eye, and then you can see clearly to take the splinter out of your brother's or sister's eye. What Jesus is saying to his disciples and to us who would be followers of Jesus, he is saying, if we are to love as Christ loves, if we are to serve, really serve people, if we are to be God's people in the world, if we are to walk in the footsteps of Jesus, then we have to get that log out of our eye to be able to see clearly in order to really serve and to really love and to really be of help to others. There's a little boy who many, many years ago in West Virginia wrote an essay on the assigned topic, "What is a person?" His essay became pretty widely circulated a number of years ago because it's funny, it's cute, but also because of the last line of his essay. So he wrote, "What is a person? When you are a person, your head is kind of round and hard, and your brains are in it, and your hair is on it. Your face is in the front of your head where you eat and make faces. Your neck is what keeps your head out of your collar, and it's hard to keep clean. Your shoulders are sort of shelves where you hook on your suspenders, and your stomach is something that if you don't eat often enough, it hurts, and spinach don't help none. Your spine is a long bone in your back that's always behind you no matter how quick you turn around. Your arms you've got to have to pitch with, and so you can reach the butter. Your fingers stick out of your hands so you can throw a curve and add up arithmetic. Your legs are what you run on, and your toes are what always get stubbed. And that's all there is of you except what's on the inside, and I ain't never seen that yet. What's on the inside? It's the hardest thing of all to see. And yet it's what Jesus calls us to see, to look beyond the surface at a depth where we can truly see our brother or our sister. Then we're able to help. To get the log out of our own eye, to deal with our own issues, to face who we really are so that we can have some compassion for the other. Then we can truly help. to deal with that thing in ourselves that we're so quick to condemn in another, so that we can really help and be compassionate. That's what Jesus calls us to do. Back in the 1930s, a mother took her son to see Mohandas Gandhi with a strange request. She said to him, "I want you to tell my son not to eat sugar. Sugar's bad for him." So Gandhi, in a cryptic way, just looked at her and said, "Come back next week." And so a week later, she brought her son back to Mahatma Gandhi. And she said, "Well, we're back." Motioned to her son. And so Gandhi looked at the boy and said, "You should not eat sugar. It's not good for you." And then he joked around with the boy a little bit. And when it was time for them to leave, the mother said, "Well, why couldn't you have just told him that last week instead of having us come back?" And Gandhi smiled. And he said, "Because last week I was eating sugar." I really like that. He wanted to deal with that issue in his own life, even something as minor as that, before he lectured another on the same thing. What's that in your eye? Is it a log? Jesus calls us to take it out. And it's my hope and prayer as we go from this place, I mean, this is for me and for you, that we would be able to say, now, I'm not one to judge, and leave it at that. Amen.